Welcome to the deep dive. All right, so today we're going deep on some seriously complex stuff, linguistic theory.
Oh, yeah.
We've got a whole stack of papers here focusing on Noam Chomsky's barriers from 1986.
Classic.
So yeah, get ready, folks, because we're about to break down some seriously mind-bending concepts. We'll be exploring how sentences are built, what makes them tick, all that good stuff. You could think of it like a crash course in the hidden code of language, I guess.
Absolutely.
Expert speaker, you ready to take on Chomsky?
Let's do it.
Yeah.
Chomsky's work it really is the bedrock of how we understand language, how it works.
Yeah.
It's amazing, actually, when you think about it. Like, why do some sentences sound so right, so natural to us,
Yeah.
while others just sound totally off? Let's unpack that.
Okay, so to kind of kick things off, let's tackle one of Chomsky's big ideas, X-bar theory. Now, from what I've been able to gather, it's basically like a blueprint for how phrases are put together, their structure. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. X-bar theory says there's this kind of like template, a consistent structure for how phrases are built. And at the center of every phrase, there's this core element, the head, kind of like the foundation of a house.
Okay, I think I'm following so far. So let's say we've got a simple sentence like the cat sat on the mat, right?
Right.
So in that case, sat would be the head, since it's the verb, the action word.
Exactly. And what's so brilliant about Chomsky is he takes this idea beyond just, simple words like nouns and verbs and applies it to these more abstract elements like inflection and complementizer. Those are the things that deal with tense, like past, present, future, and how clauses connect to each other in a sentence.
Inflection and complementizer, huh? Those sound a little complicated. Can you maybe give me an example of how those fit into this X-bar blueprint we're talking about?
Of course. Let's take that same sentence. The cat sat on the mat, but let's add in will. The cat will sit on the mat. Now, will, that little word there,
Yeah.
that tells us it's going to happen in the future.
Yeah, future tense.
Exactly. That's inflection. And Chomsky argues that even these tiny words, the ones that kind of modify the verb, they have their own structure within the X-bar framework. They're not just floating around randomly. They're part of this bigger system.
Interesting. So it's not just about the individual words themselves, but also how they all fit together, like in these chunks, these meaningful units.
Exactly. And another really important thing about this book, Barriers, is that it shows us a real shift in how Chomsky was thinking. He's kind of refining his ideas, specifically how phrases are organized, and how the stuff inside them are connected, which if you think about it, that's a really, really important part of his theory of government.
Okay, government. Now that sounds a bit intense.
Yeah.
But before we go there, I just want to make sure I'm totally clear on this whole X-bar thing, Can you maybe walk us through like a concrete example, maybe even straight from the text, like comparing the cat sat on the mat to a slightly different sentence, just to kind of nail it down?
Sure. Let's add quietly to that sentence. So now it's the cat sat on the mat quietly. So now we've got on the mat and quietly, right? They're both, kind of giving us more information about the verb, about how the cat sat. But X-bar theory helps us see they have different roles, they have different jobs.
Okay.
Like on the mat is a complement. It's directly connected to the verb. It's saying where the cat sat. But quietly is an adjunct. It's adding a description, but it's not like essential to the core meaning of the sentence.
Ah, okay, I see. So it's not just about labeling words, but also understanding how they relate to each other, like these complements and adjuncts and how they all fit together.
Exactly. And all this, it kind of lays the groundwork for understanding another big concept in barriers, and that's movement.
Movement? Wait, so you're saying like words can actually jump around in a sentence?
They can, in a way.
Oh, I have a feeling this is where things get really, really interesting.
It does. Chomsky's saying the order of words we see in a sentence. On the surface, that's not always the whole story. Words can move, and when they do, they leave behind a trace. Think of it like an invisible mark, showing where they were originally.
Yeah, hold on. So in a question like, what did the cat see? You're saying that what has actually moved from its spot at the end of the sentence.
Exactly.
Whoa.
And Chomsky says there are two main types of movement. Substitution, that's where a word kind of fills in a specific slot. And then there's adjunction, where a word attaches to an existing phrase, like it's kind of tagging along. But, and this is key, these movements, they aren't random. They follow very, very specific rules, grammatical rules.
Okay, so there's a method to the madness. I'm starting to see just how complex all of this is. But how does this whole idea of words moving How does that connect back to X-bar theory? Are these movements happening within those phrases we were talking about, those structures?
That is a great question, and it leads us right to the concept of government, which is...
Okay, government. All right, lay it on me. What is Chomsky even talking about when he says that word?
Well, you can think of government as a kind of influence that one word has over another word in a sentence. Like a verb, for example. It can govern its object.
Mm-hmm.
So in our classic sentence, the cat sat on the mat. The verb sat, it governs the mat because, well, the mat is what the cat sat on.
Okay, so government is like about setting up these connections between words. But you also mentioned something about barriers earlier. What role did they play in all of this?
Ah, yes, the barriers. Well, barriers are like, imagine these invisible walls within a sentence, right? And they actually block that government, that influence from reaching certain words or phrases. And this is where it gets really interesting because Chomsky says there are different kinds of barriers.
Wait. So there are different types of these invisible walls. Okay, now you've got me hooked. Tell me more.
So one type of barrier is inherent. It's based on a word's category, like what kind of word it is. So a noun phrase, for example, might inherently block certain types of government. The other type of barrier, though, this was created by something called the minimality condition. That's a fancy way of saying, basically, that a word that's closer to another word, it can block government from a word further away. Kind of like a game of linguistic capture the flag,
Yeah.
where, some words can block others from reaching their target.
Okay, I think I'm getting there. But examples always help. Could you maybe give us a sentence, maybe straight from barriers, that shows how these barriers make a sentence ungrammatical?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Let's look at what Chomsky calls super-raising constructions. He gives this example. John seems that it is certain to win. Now that just sounds wrong, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. It feels clunky.
And the reason is that the phrase that it is certain, it's acting like a barrier. It's preventing the verb seems from properly governing, having that influence over John. And that's what makes it ungrammatical. That barrier is in the way.
So the position of words and these barriers, they can actually determine whether a sentence makes sense or just sounds like total gibberish.
Exactly. And Chomsky, he dives even deeper into how all this works, explaining why some sentences that seem simple on the surface, they're actually incredibly complex underneath. It's like those optical illusions that play tricks on your brain, making you see something that isn't really there.
Wow. Okay, this is blowing my mind. We've already covered so much. X-bar theory, the idea of words moving, government, and now barriers. And honestly, I think we're just scratching the surface here. I need a minute to process all of this. What about you? Anything standing out to you so far?
What I find so fascinating is how Chomsky takes all of these really, really abstract ideas and he uses them to explain how we actually use language in the real world. It's like he's giving us a key to this hidden code that underpins how we communicate.
Yeah, I'm with you there. Okay, I think I'm ready to keep going. What's next on our linguistic adventure? What other rabbit holes are we diving into?
Well, we talked about government in general, right? But there's a specific type of government that's really, really important in barriers, and that's what Chomsky calls proper government. And it has even more rules.
Ooh, even stricter rules. All right, now I'm really interested. Tell me more.
Well, let's dive in and see what makes this proper government so special. So proper government, you can think of it like government with some extra rules. Right?
Okay.
It's not enough for a word to just influence another. There needs to be a specific kind of connection for it to be properly governed. It's like a higher standard.
Ooh, stricter rules, huh? All right, I'm all ears. What kind of special connections are we talking about here?
Well, Chomsky lays out two main types. There's cue government and then there's antecedent government.
Okay.
So cue government, that has to do with how they actually assign roles to the words they govern. So, for example, in a sentence like the cat chased the mouse, the verb chased is assigning the role of like the patient to the mouse.
Yeah.
That's cue government in action.
So it's like the verb is giving a job description to the noun it's governing. Like, you're the patient in this sentence.
Exactly. You got it. Now, antecedent government, this one gets a bit trickier. This one comes into play when we're talking about words that have moved. Remember those traces we talked about earlier?
Oh, yeah. Like in our what did the cat see example.
Right, exactly. So what moved, right? Leaving that trace behind. Well, in that case, what, even though it's moved, it's still actually governing its own trace. That's antecedent government. It's kind of governing itself from afar.
Okay. I think I think I'm starting to see the difference between those two. But why is all this talk about government? Why is it so important? What does it actually do in Chomsky's theory?
Well, this is where we get to one of the most mind-bending parts of barriers,
Yeah.
and that's the idea of empty categories.
Empty categories. All right, I'm ready.
So, remember how we were saying that when words move, they leave behind those invisible traces. Well, those traces, those are examples of empty categories. They're not pronounced. We don't actually hear them when we say the sentence, but they're still super important because they're part of the sentence's structure.
So it's like there are these ghost words, these phantom words just floating around in the sentence, influencing things, even though we can't actually hear them.
That's a great way to put it. Yeah, like ghost words.
Yeah.
And so Chomsky, he introduces this principle called the empty category principle, or ECP for short.
Yeah.
And this principle, it governs how those empty categories, how they behave.
Okay.
It basically says that for an empty category to be, grammatical, for it to work in the sentence, it has to be properly governed.
Wait, hold on. So if one of those phantom traces, if it's not properly governed, then the whole sentence is messed up. It's ungrammatical.
Exactly. It's like a missing piece of the puzzle. It just doesn't quite fit together right. Let's take a look at an example. Maybe that'll make it a bit clear. So how about this sentence? How did Bill wonder who wanted to fix the car? Now that sounds a bit off, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. It feels a little clunky, a little awkward.
Right. And that's because the trace that's left behind by how, it's not properly governed. The word wanted, it is governing the trace, but not in the right way. It's not the kind of government that satisfies the ECP.
Okay, I see. So this idea of proper government, it explains why some sentences just sound natural while others, they just sound wrong, even if we can't put our finger on exactly why they sound wrong.
Precisely. Mm-hmm. Exactly. And this principle, it applies to a whole bunch of different sentence structures. It helps us see these hidden rules that dictate how words can and can't move around.
Okay, this proper government thing, it's pretty powerful stuff. But before we go any further, I want to make sure I'm connecting the dots for our listeners, Why should they care about something like proper government or these empty categories? It seems pretty abstract, how does this affect their lives?
That's a great question. And you're right, it might seem like we're really deep in the weeds here. But all of these ideas, they actually have real-world implications for how we understand language, how it works. They help explain why we, as speakers of a language, why we find certain sentences grammatical or ungrammatical, even if we can't explain the rules ourselves, consciously.
So it's like Chomsky's giving us this framework, this way to understand the underlying logic of language, even if we're not aware of it when we're just talking to each other, in everyday conversation.
Exactly. It's like he's mapping out this invisible architecture, this structure that gives shape to our thoughts, to how we communicate.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. Okay, I think I'm ready to keep going. Where do we go from here? What's the next big concept from barriers that we need to tackle?
All right, let's talk about subjacency. This is where Chomsky really starts to set some limits on how far a word or a phrase can move.
So words can't just teleport around a sentence however they want. There are rules, like traffic laws in this linguistic world.
You got it. That's a great way to think about it. Subjacency, it's basically saying that movement, it can't jump over too many barriers at once. Remember those invisible walls we were talking about?
Yeah, the ones that block government.
Right, exactly. So subjacency is like saying you can only hop over a certain number of those walls in one move. If you try to jump too far, well, then the sentence becomes ungrammatical.
Okay, I see. So it's like a long distance move, right? You can't just take everything in one trip. You got to do it in stages.
Exactly. You have to make multiple trips. And Chomsky, he proposes that this is actually how movement often works, in this successive cyclic fashion, he calls it, moving through these intermediate positions so it doesn't, break the rules.
Okay, so it's like there are rest stops along the way for these migrating words. They can't just go directly to the destination. They got to stop and refuel, so to speak. Can you maybe give us a real world example of how this works? A sentence where we can see these rest stops in action?
Sure. Let's consider the sentence. How does John think you fixed the car? All right. So the word how It starts way back in the embedded clause in that you fix the car part.
Okay, yeah.
And it wants to get all the way to the front of the sentence, right?
Yeah.
But it can't just jump there directly. It has to move in stages.
Yeah.
First, it moves to a position within that embedded clause, and then it can move up to the main clause. Subjacency is the rule that's making it stop at those rest stops.
Oh, okay, I see. So subjacency it's kind of like a traffic cop, making sure everything stays orderly, making sure sentences don't just become this tangled mess of misplaced words and phrases.
Exactly. It's about maintaining this balance between flexibility, letting words move around, and structure, making sure the sentence still makes sense.
Okay, I'm seeing how this rule it contributes to the overall elegance of language, how it all fits together.
Yeah.
But let's be honest, this is getting pretty abstract, How does subjacency relate to our everyday lives? What's the takeaway for our listeners? Why should they care?
Well, it's a great question. You're right. We might not be consciously aware of it, but subjacency, it's actually at work all the time. Whenever we use language, it plays a role in how we just intuitively, how we judge whether a sentence sounds natural or awkward. Even without knowing the technical terms, our brains are wired to follow these rules.
So it's like subjacency is part of this invisible code that makes human language possible.
Precisely. Yeah. And it's not just about individual sentences either. Subjacency helps explain these broader patterns in language, like those island effects we mentioned earlier.
Island effects. Oh, yeah. Those sounded interesting. Can you remind us what those are again?
Sure. So think of island effects as these specific zones within a sentence where it's really, really hard, sometimes even impossible, to extract a word or a phrase. Like those words are stuck on a deserted island, They can't escape.
Okay, I definitely need an example to picture this. What kind of grammatical structure creates one of these linguistic islands?
One of the most common types is what we call the Y island. And it's created when you have a question embedded inside of another question. For example, take this sentence, what did you wonder who saw? That just sounds wrong, doesn't it?
It does sound off, yeah.
And that's because the word what, it's trying to, escape. It's trying to move out of that clause that already has the way phrase who in it. And who is acting like a barrier, creating this Y island that's trapping what inside.
So it's like who has built a wall around its island and what can't climb over it.
Exactly. That's a great way to put it. And subjacency, that's the rule that's enforcing this boundary. It's saying, nope, movement can't just jump over an island like that.
This is fascinating. Are there other types of islands besides these Y islands?
Oh, absolutely.
Right.
There are. Another common one is what we call the complex noun phrase island. It's a bit of a mouthful, but basically it's triggered when you have a phrase that's embedded inside of a complex noun phrase. Let me give you an example. So think about this sentence. Which article did John hear a rumor that Mary had read? Now try to move which article to the front, make it a question. It just sounds weird, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. It's like, which article did John hear a rumor that Mary had read? It's just, no.
Exactly. And that's because which article, it's strapped inside this complex noun phrase that a rumor that Mary had read part. It's an island.
Okay, so these islands, they're like linguistic fortresses or something. They protect certain phrases from being moved around too much.
That's a great way to put it. Yeah, like a fortresses. And these island effects, they're not just random.
Yeah.
Chomsky argues that they actually reflect these deeper principles about how our minds process language.
Right.
It's like they're helping to keep things clear, preventing sentences from becoming too convoluted, too hard to understand.
This is all making more and more sense, but I want to make sure I'm connecting the dots for our listeners. Why should they care about these islands? What's the real world takeaway here?
Well, these island effects, they actually play a role in how we just intuitively how we judge whether a sentence is grammatically correct or not. Even if we don't know all the the technical terms, our brains, they have a sense of which moves are allowed and which ones aren't. Which ones cross the line.
So it's like our brains they're constantly doing all this complex linguistic calculation in the background without us even realizing it.
Exactly. Chomsky's work, it's really giving us this window into those hidden processes. It's revealing just how amazing, how complex the human language faculty really is.
Okay, I am officially in awe of my own brain right now.
Right.
So I remember you mentioning something called the Y island condition earlier. Is that related to these Y islands you've been talking about?
It is. It is. The Y island condition, it's a more specific rule, you could say. It governs movement when we're dealing with those Y phrases, like who, what, where, and so on. And and it says basically that you can't move a phrase out of a sentence if that sentence already have a Y phrase in a certain position. Remember our sentence from earlier? What did you wonder who saw? That's actually a violation of the Y island condition, which is why it sounds so awkward.
Okay. I see. So it's like a double whammy of whiteness. It creates this like extra strong barrier.
Exactly. But here's where it gets really, really interesting. Chomsky introduces this idea of parameters.
Okay.
And parameters, you can think of like these subtle little switches in the grammar that can actually be different between different languages.
Hold on, wait. So you're saying that these rules, they can actually change depending on what language you're speaking? Like what might be like totally ungrammatical in English could be perfectly fine in, I don't know, in Spanish or French?
That's exactly it. Chomsky is proposing that the Y island condition, for example, it can work slightly differently across languages. So, like something that's totally blocked in English might be perfectly acceptable in Italian or vice versa. It all depends on how that parameter is set in that specific language.
That's incredible. So it's not just about this like one set of universal rules. There's actually variation built into the system. There's flexibility.
Exactly. And that's a huge part of what makes Chomsky's theory so powerful.
Yeah.
It allows us to explain both the things that are common across all languages and the things that make each language unique.
Okay, mind blown yet again. I think I need a minute to process this whole parameter idea. It really just highlights how diverse, how creative human language really is. What about you? Anything stand out to you about this concept?
For me, the concept of parameters, it's really exciting because it gives us this framework, this way to think about language acquisition. How do children learn which parameters are set for their language? It's like this incredible detective game figuring out how our brains figure out language.
Yeah, that's a great point. There's so much we still don't know about how language works, but Chomsky's work, it's giving us these amazing tools to explore these mysteries.
Okay, ready for the next mind-bending concept.
Let's do it. Let's talk about the vacuous movement hypothesis. This one gets a little tricky, but stick with me.
Bring it on. We've come this far. I'm ready for anything at this point.
Right. All right. So the vacuous movement hypothesis, or VMH for short, it deals with these situations where it looks like a wing phrase hasn't moved, But Chomsky, he's arguing that there might actually be a hidden movement happening at a deeper level, even though we can't see it on the surface. Like it's moving undercover. Okay. So it's like a linguistic stealth mission. The word is moving, but it's doing it secretly.
That's a great analogy. Yeah, exactly. So, for example, think about a sentence like, the man who John likes. It looks like who is just sitting there in its normal spot. Right?
That's not at the beginning of the sentence like it would be in a question.
Right, exactly. But Chomsky, he's arguing that even in this case, who has actually moved. It's moved to this higher position in the sentence structure. We don't see it overtly. It's happening behind the scenes.
Okay, so it's like there's this secret level of linguistic structure where these movements are happening, kind of like a backstage area where the real magic is going on.
Exactly. And Chomsky's argument is that this vacuous movement, as he calls it, it's actually necessary. We need it to explain certain grammatical properties of the sentence, like how those phrases are interpreted, what they mean, even when they don't seem to have moved.
Okay, I think I'm starting to see the logic here, but why would language have these invisible movements? What's the purpose?
That's a great question, and it gets at some really, really deep questions about the nature of language itself. Chomsky's suggestion is that this VMH, it might actually reflect the underlying principles that guide how we learn language, how we acquire language as children. He thinks children might initially just assume that all word phrases move, even when there's no obvious evidence for it. Mm-hmm. And then as they get older, as they hear more and more examples, they kind of fine-tune their understanding. They learn the exceptions.
So it's like a default setting in the language learning process. Kids start with this assumption that everything moves, and then they kind of adjust as they go along.
Exactly. And it's a really fascinating insight into how our brains might be, how they might be wired for language.
This is blowing my mind again. Before we move on, let's pause for a second and connect this back to our listeners. Why should they care about this vacuous movement hypothesis? What's the takeaway message?
Well, it might seem like we're getting really deep into theoretical territory here.
Yeah.
But the VMH, it has implications for how we understand language in general, how it evolved, how it develops. It suggests that there are these deep, abstract principles that guide how we learn and process language.
So it's about uncovering those universal features of human language, the things that make us, the things that make us capable of communication in the first place.
Precisely. The VMH, it's just one piece of the puzzle.
Yeah.
But it's a really fascinating glimpse into these intricate workings of the language faculty,
Yeah.
This amazing ability that we have as humans.
Okay, I'm ready for the next piece. What other linguistic wonders are waiting for us in Chomsky's barriers?
All right, let's talk about parasitic gaps.
Parasitic gaps. Okay, that sounds intriguing. I'm all ears.
So parasitic gaps, they're these constructions that often sound a little bit strange on the surface. They sound a little bit off, but they actually reveal a lot about the hidden structure of sentences.
Okay. Wait, give me an example. I got to hear this.
All right, so think about this sentence. John filed the report without reading it.
Now, notice how there's this implied meaning here, right? It's as if we said without reading the report.
Right. It's like there's an the report lurking in that sentence somewhere.
Exactly. And that invisible the report, that's what we call a parasitic gap. It's an empty category, but it depends on the main gap, the it in this case, for its existence.
So it's like a shadow gap. It's borrowing its meaning from the real gap. Perfect analogy. Yeah, like a shadow gap. And Chomsky argues that these parasitic gaps, they actually challenge these earlier, simpler theories of movement. He's proposing that there has to be a separate empty operator involved.
Okay.
And this empty operator, it's creating its own movement chain, which then, gives permission, so to speak, for that parasitic gap to exist.
Wait, so it's not just one movement happening. It's like multiple movements, all linked together. My brain it's starting to hurt.
I know. It's a lot to keep track of, but it just highlights how incredibly complex the system that Chomsky is describing really is, and there are even more constraints on these parasitic gaps. There's something called the anti-command requirement.
Okay, you're using too many technical terms now. Break it down for us. What's this anti-command rule all about?
So basically, it's a rule about where that parasitic gap can appear, where it can be in relation to the main gap. It can't be in a position that's commanded by the main gap, which means it has to be, lower down in the sentence structure in the hierarchy.
So it's like the parasitic gap has to stay in its lane. It can't outrank the main gap.
Exactly. That's a great way to put it. And this rule, like all the other ones we've talked about, it helps make sure the sentences stay, clear, that they're easy to process, even with all this complex movement happening behind the scenes.
Okay, I'm starting to see the pattern here. Every rule seems to be contributing to this overall goal of keeping language structured, keeping it comprehensible. But let's be honest, this parasitic gap stuff, it's pretty abstract. Why should our listeners, why should they care about this?
Well, these parasitic gaps, they might seem like these, obscure little grammatical phenomena, but they actually show us something really profound about the nature of language itself. They demonstrate that sentences, they're not just these, linear strings of words. They're these intricate structures with these hidden dependencies and multiple layers of meaning. It's amazing.
So it's like Chomsky's peeling back the layers of an onion, showing us just how complex, how much is going on beneath the surface of everyday speech.
Exactly. These seemingly strange constructions, like parasitic gaps, they're like clues, They're helping us understand the inner workings of the language faculty, revealing the amazing computational power of the human brain.
Okay, I'm officially in awe of my own brain, I gotta say. We've covered so much ground today, from X-bar theory all the way to parasitic gaps. It's been a whirlwind tour of Chomsky's barriers, that's for sure. And I'm feeling both exhausted and exhilarated at the same time. What about you? What are your final thoughts on this incredible work?
For me, what's most striking is how Chomsky takes all these seemingly totally different phenomena, all these different things about language, and he shows how they can all be explained by a relatively small set of core principles. It's really a testament to the elegance and the power of his theory.
Absolutely. And for you listening, we hope this deep dive has given you a new appreciation for the hidden complexities of language. We've just scratched the surface here, but hopefully this has sparked your curiosity, made you want to learn more.
And don't be afraid to, play around with language yourself. Pay attention to what sounds right, what sounds wrong. See if you can apply some of Chomsky's ideas, to figure out why. It's like a linguistic puzzle. And it's incredibly rewarding to try and solve it.
Until next time, happy deep diving.